The amount of literature available concerning the Civil War far exceeds any other topic in American history. Topics ranging from tactics and strategies, African American studies, women's studies, home front issues, all garner considerable attention from historians and authors alike. However, one area still remains open to historians who dare to venture into what is typically considered no man's land, that is, prisoners of war. The literature on prisoners of war during the Civil War is often divided into two sections. The first being the experiences of prisoners of war, and that could come in the form of edited diaries or on topics such as escape or large numbers of deaths, to the second section, which is prison camps, and that's going to include works like on Andersonville or New York's Elmira or Chicago's Camp Douglas. Rarely, if ever, however, have historians ventured into military law and how the government viewed the actual plight of prisoners of war. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the literature regarding prisoners of war, they were motivated, I guess you could say, politically on both sides. Here you're going to see the whole let's raise the bloody flag, let's blame one side for the other for the types of treatment, let's continue to divide the nation type attitudes. Out of this, we see this because of diaries that were either heavily embellished, were accurate, or were even falsified, as in The Soldier Was Never a Prisoner. It's not going to be until 1930 that we actually get the first significant study on prison camps. And this is going to come in the form of William B. Heseltine's 1928 dissertation, Civil War Prisons, a Study of War Psychology. It has stood the test of time. It is the preeminent scholarly work that historians still turn to today. It's a balanced approach, finding fault on both sides for significant concerns, but he doesn't blame the Confederacy for their inability to provide, and he doesn't necessarily lay complete blame at the Union feet for any type of mistreatment. But what he does point out is that the Union Army did have a commissary general for prison camps, something that the Confederacy didn't have until near the end of the war. 30 years is going to elapse from that very first seminal to the next work. And that's going to be the first truly significant study on a prison camp. In 1968, Ovid Futch published Andersonville, an objective look at the prison camp, basing his arguments solely on logistics. He is going to attempt to demonstrate that if Andersonville had the logistical means, that the camp would not have deteriorated to the point that it had reached within its 14 months of operation. Though historians such as Heseltine, Futch, as well as James I. Robertson Jr. would continue to create articles in the 1970s and early 80s, there's no real significant growth in the historiography on Civil War, prisoners of war. However, in 1988, Civil War historian James McPherson is actually going to make I guess you could say, a call to service to Civil War historians by notating that while Civil War prisons were the most controversial in the topic, they were rarely ever examined in the broader theme. So historians are going to actually start combing through the literature that's available. They're going to start mining the primary source documentation such as the War of the Rebellion, the diaries, the newspaper articles and accounts, as well as analyzing it all together. And while most did actually focus on the Confederacy, some did actually take a hard look at the Union stance. They all, though, typically came to the same conclusion. In their opinion and in their arguments, the Confederacy system was far worse than that of those of the Union. But none of them were actually examining the legal understandings. They were not examining the congressional records to see the arguments for retaliation. And they were not exploring Francis Lieber and his contribution to military law. And if they did, it was to understand the idea of military necessity. Rather, it was the legal scholars who have decided to take on Francis Lieber and place heavy emphasis on understanding his codification of wars, also known as General Orders Number 100, to understand the development of international humanitarian law, where they have actually placed great emphasis on the various ideas as far as the treatment of prisoners, the conditions that they were supposed to be kept, medical care, the definitions, and looking at how His counterparts after the war implemented these in Germany, Britain, and France, but how the international community also embraced them. They focused on things like the Geneva Conventions of 1864, 1868, 1929, and 1949, in addition to St. Petersburg and the Brussels Conventions, in their search for understanding the development of international humanitarian law. So though the literature on the Civil War is exhaustive, there is plenty of room for growth. Prisoners of war and the legalities surrounding their treatment, conditions, and the definitions of prisoners of war, as described by Lieber in his General Orders number 100, have yet to be fully examined and explored by historians. There are questions that the historiography has not answered, such as the motivations of Lieber. Who was Lieber? Why was he the best qualified to take on this heavy task? In addition, there is the idea of how the Union and Confederate armies either accepted or even rejected the Lieber's codes. Similarly, there is only one significant biography on Francis Lieber, and that was written in 1948 by Frank Friedel. So when taken into consideration, this historiographical gap in the Civil War is huge. Prisoners of war were ignored for so often, they were bypassed comments. But Francis Lieber gave the Union Army a set of laws and usages of war. He provided the answers to questions that the Articles of War of 1806 did not answer. Those questions revolved around spying, parole, retaliation, prisoners of war, as well as guerrilla warfare. Ultimately, however, Lieber gave the Union Army the manual on how to deal with these. And in doing so, he provided the means for a development of common international law.